We're rolling. Oh shit, all right. Well, we're not messing about, boys. I'll do an intro. So I'm Jack. I've worked as a designer coming up to 15 years. I studied graphic design in the UK. I had an opportunity to move to New York in 2010. Through a bunch of strange circumstances, ended up kind of jumping around the agency scene in New York. I read a story about why The Last Supper became the most famous image in Europe. And it had way more to do with the infrastructure for printing than the image. Like the aspect ratio of it, I think, was more replicable than the portrait or the triptych. So obviously an amazing piece of art and commenting on culture, society, like the images that represent the way people like decipher the world. But there are also all these other factors around the distribution of the image that made it what it was. So visualized value originally started as, like now I call it art in hindsight, but at the time it was more of a way to demonstrate the type of work that I wanted to be doing for other people, and it was still like almost like a cleaner version of the agency business where you have a very specific skill set that you can express consistently by putting media out into the world. And that basically led to a better version of that model where, because the work I was putting out was so consistent, people identified with that, and I would then partner with people who actually wanted the thing I was producing. It's like a flip in the way the mechanics work. In the agency business, you're like trying to convince somebody to do something. And when you have a body of work out there that resonates, they're like trying to convince you to work with them. I used to have this like debate in my head when I was in the agency business where like there's distinction between art direction and strategy, or art direction and copywriting, and you would have like people in very specific camps in those worlds where like I'm an art worker, right? I make something look a certain way. And then you have strategists, writers, people who would consider themselves idea people. And the feedback loop that I loved the most in that world was like sitting in a room for 4 weeks to try and come up with like one line or one image or one that just like compresses everything and solves the creative problem that you're trying to solve. That to me feels like, especially the internet being the canvas where you have way more of a opportunity to build bottom-up consensus than like distribute through a gallery, for instance, that has this, transferable clout, where it's like, this is a good idea because we say it's a good idea versus this is a good idea because 10,000 wallets minted it in 60 minutes. And that was actually a realization I had with checks. There was more pieces minted by a factor of 16 than there were likes on Twitter, which you would never. It's like a huge chicken and egg situation, right? It's like, is this expensive because it's good, or is this good because it's expensive, or like vice versa? Maybe expensive is the wrong word there. It's like, is there economic energy surrounding this because it's like universally recognized as good, or vice versa? I think one of the things I've honestly appreciated about Zora's language around how to approach Ethereum as a medium is almost a sketchbook. A lot of the market dynamics in, euphoric times like 2021, I think it led a lot of artists to kind of really limit what they would express on that medium, right? You'd say, I'm only gonna mint 5 pieces a year or 6 pieces a year, whatever. And this is like completely a game of networks. It's like, even if you're creating amazing stuff, if you only have that like distributed among 5 people, it's really, really difficult to find traction. And this idea of just lowering the barrier to entry for people to participate in your work, in your art, in your like the group of people that you have who have coalesced around the work you've been doing, to me is like a fundamental shift that I would like to see happen and like to see more of. Is like, I don't know, these are like inherited economics from old world art, right? Where the last sale price of your art is basically the cap on your career. And if the next piece sells for less, then you're in trouble. So that to me feels basically incompatible with, one, the scale of a network you need to like even test the resonance of something, and two, it feels incongruent with the internet as a medium. I think that's probably a better way to say it, is like the replication of the ideas that you put out into the world are a function of how many people they resonate with and they can get behind them. And if you can create a deeper connection, you have, in my mind, a better chance of like making that a sustainable pursuit than, you know, trying to really orchestrate these like 4 or 5 things a year that have to incrementally like do better and better and better and better. I'm strongly lean into the idea that ideas have people, for sure. You're basically an antenna and you're pulling in all of this signal, remixing it and sending it back out. There's no, it's no coincidence that like a lot of amazing creative people are DJs, right? And play with music and like compose time and space. It's interesting because maybe it is a reflection of the infrastructure in some way too. Like I think music especially is like that idea of remixing or replaying or recombining music is so much more acceptable because there's like a vehicle for the original artist to capture the value of that thing, right? Like somebody popular does a remix of your song, very, very likely that the original drafts off that and gets way more exposure. And we don't really, or we haven't until recently, had that dynamic in the visual art world, right? There's no relationship set up between those two things. And that's like, even thinking forward about where the infrastructure goes, I think there will be this like referential quality to like on-chain art where this inspired this, inspired this, inspired this, and there are these connections flowing back and forth, and they all kind of become a stronger system as a function of like making those connections. I wrote this the other day, somebody probably said this before me, is like this idea of provenance being a cumulative thing. A real example of this, when these couple projects took off earlier this year, a lot of interest, attention, and capital went back into like pieces of work that I'd minted years before that. The ability to discover an artist's body of work and like what led them to the thing that you're seeing now, and even give you a greater understanding of why they produced it or why it might be even more thoughtful than you originally understood it to be. There's a difference between minting an image that resonates from a fresh wallet, right? And that same image coming from somebody who's been like dancing around that idea for 3 or 4 years and finally found a way to encapsulate it in a way that resonates at way broader scale. And I think the old, and I fall into this trap too, is like the preciousness of minting a piece of work still feels like you have to get this thing to X. It has to be like the gallery wall, right? And I think we lose a lot of, well, there's just so much that is getting lost in having that be the bar for work that gets preserved or ideas that get recorded in that way. Because again, it's this scarcity or the like thinking about this in terms of supply and demand rather than a record of work. I've always thought of this as strange from back in the agency days, this idea that you're doing all this work but you don't show any of it. You just show up and like, here's this final thing. And for your art career to be sustainable on the internet, in my view, like it can't just be about the thing that comes out of the process. The work that you're already doing to produce it, there's obviously work in converting that into something that goes out into the world, but finding a medium that lets you express that in real time, for me, is writing. It's like, here's a decision I'm weighing up between this and this. Doing that publicly has, I think, become definitely a part of the work itself. I guess it's a decision on how to frame the work, but it's also maybe a shift in defining what is actually the work. What we're doing right here, right? Like we're filming this thing. The 2-minute, 3-minute, 5-minute video that comes out of this process is I'm not gonna say the least interesting part of it, but it's probably, it undersells the conversation, the thinking, the preparation that goes into something like this. So I think we're gonna see maybe a change in the perception around sharing the process. And in different worlds, I think that already exists. Like, there's a preciousness in art that I completely understand and come from that perspective of, it's not ready, don't ship it. Like, the final piece isn't ready. And I think that we're like even moving away from that idea of the thing being finished. That's art is never finished, only abandoned. And I think even that now just extends to talking about the process itself. And sometimes that's such a different skill set that's where you see people able to attain or obtain more attention than others, because a lot of people have that incredible narrative trapped in their head because they might not be a great speaker, writer, like not great on camera, whatever it might be, but they're an incredible artist. And yeah, it feels like the internet as a medium really rewards the people that can explain why they're doing this, and decisions made along the way. And if people, I think there's very few cases where if the final product resonates, that the process wouldn't resonate too. It's just finding a compelling way to share it. Checks is a piece of art that follows, I think, more of the rules of the traditional art world, where you have a canvas and an image and it's something that you might display on a wall somewhere. And this is playing with a bunch of different themes from the formats that made NFTs global news phenomenon. So it's an avatar project. It's a really simple geometric outline that can basically be generated infinitely. You can pull in any combination of keywords that reference visual consciousness and re-render this thing, but everybody's going to recognize the outline, whether it's rendered in pink fur or like pointillism style. So playing with that idea of who is creating that thing. If I'm the author of the format, which was also informed by a bunch of other formats that I've been exposed to, and create that as a canvas for people to remix, the thing that I'm weighing up and trying to explore now is how much agency does somebody have over the token? There's 16,000 of them, just short of 16,000 of them, and my current approach is to render 16,000 of them myself individually, which is also like a commentary on hard work in the age of AI, right? Like, that's not quick to go in and like manually do that. If they take, I think I did the math on this, if I'm doing 10 minutes per piece for 16,000 pieces, it's 300 days or something. It's a long time. Even while I'm working on it right now, like the rate at which the ability to generate the images is changing. It's like, do I go back to the start and start at one, or do I, basically mint these in sequence? So here's the tool I'm using to generate the first 100, and then if it takes me a year to make all of them, then the first 100 are indicative of where the technology was at that time, and the last 100 look completely different, but have that unifying, they still reference that original geometry. Yeah, man, there's so many good Virgil quotes on was it all images are temporary? I think he said that. Just an incredible positioning of this idea that culture, another Virgil, I think he said, culture moves as fast as Instagram scrolls. And it comes back to the signature idea, right? That's the Off-White quotes, like the speed at which culture moves, you can comment on it while adding your signature to that commentary without being boxed into a given aesthetic. You've created this format that's building equity and signing your ability to sign your work, which is we're not even talking about the Ethereum transaction here. We're talking about like a stylistic signature. But it does feel to me like that attitude or that positioning of images as a temporary thing really just positions the image as like an output of the process, and the process is the art, right? Like, they're artifacts of you just pursuing an idea, or you like pursuing your curiosity publicly for years, decades. How do we continue to like poke at this question and keep exploring the idea of, one, like what is an NFT? What is notability? How do you like build reputation cumulatively? And yeah, just thinking through ways to use Ethereum as a canvas to basically explore that question. So it's evolved now into something that's more nuanced than the first piece. But yeah, it's been a trip working on it.